from the accessory glands in the top part of the alimentary canal, and that would include the salivary glands. Salivary glands secrete that fluid we call saliva. Its purpose is to moisten food particles and help bind them together, put it into a solution. Remember, our taste buds can only sense chemicals that are in an aqueous solution. Saliva does contain enzymes that begin the chemical breakdown process. An important one is salivary amylase, which starts the breakdown of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are begin to be broken down pretty quickly in the process. They also produce bicarbonate ions, or have bicarbonate ions that act as buffers to keep the pH favorable for both enzyme activity and to protect the teeth from acidic foods. There are three pairs of salivary glands, major pairs: the parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. There are lots of minor glands scattered throughout the mucosa, found in the tongue, palate, cheeks, that help keep the lining of the mouth moist. So there are pairs of salivary glands, one on each side of the face, that have proportions of these two types of secretory cells. So they are either serous cells or mucus cells. The serous cells produce a watery fluid that contains a digestive enzyme called salivary amylase. It breaks down starches into glycogen and disaccharides, while the mucus cells secrete the mucus, which helps bind the food particles and lubricates the food while swallowing. So depending on which of the three salivary glands you're talking about, they will have more or less serous cells or mucus cells to vary the conditions of saliva in general. So the major ones are the parotid glands, which are the largest in the body of the salivary glands. They're anterior and below and behind the ears. They are mostly serous glands. Their saliva contains the enzyme amylase. Submandibular glands have both serous and mucus. They're found on the floor of the mouth, while the sublingual glands are mainly mucus, and they are found under the tongue. And I'll let you go through this chart in your book to figure out where the ducts for them exist and what type of secretions they make based on whether they are more serous or mucus. Excuse me. And there they are: parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. And this is a microscopic look at the cells themselves. Continuing down the alimentary canal, we have the pharynx and the esophagus. The pharynx is in a cavity posterior to the mouth. The pharynx would extend from the nasal cavity to the esophagus. Esophagus itself is a tubular organ that extends from the pharynx to the stomach. The pharynx and the esophagus are not involved in digestion. They are involved in the movement of food, and parts of the pharynx are involved in both the respiratory system and the digestive system. They both have muscular walls, and that's involved in swallowing. The pharynx extends into the nasal cavity, so it's in the nasal and oral cavity, divided into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Swallowing is not as easy as we make it seem when we do it. It is a very tightly regulated, reflexive action. So in the first stage, which is a voluntary stage, saliva is mixed with the chewed food, and that forms a substance we refer to as a bolus. That bolus, as it reaches the oral pharynx, is going to stimulate sensory receptors and trigger the swallowing reflex in the second stage. That involves the soft palate and the uvula rising that protects the nasal cavity from food going into it. The hyoid bone and the larynx will elevate. The epiglottis would then close off the top of the larynx. That prevents food from going down the trachea into the lungs. The longitudinal muscles of the pharynx would contract. The inferior constrictor muscles would then relax, and the esophagus would open, and peristaltic waves would force the food into the esophagus. And from there, we'd go to the third stage, in which peristaltic movements would transport the food down the tube, if you're standing upright, toward the esophagus, through the esophagus and into the stomach. Again, figure 1714 in your book can help walk you through that. The green represents the bolus as we move through those 3 stages. So that esophagus itself is a muscular food passageway from the pharynx to the stomach. It's about 25 centimeters long, penetrates the diaphragm through the esophageal hiatus. It's got a mucus glands in its submucosa. The lower sphincter that regulates entry of food into the stomach is called the cardiac sphincter. And that once it passes through the cardiac sphincter, it is into the stomach, which will be the topic of our next set of notes.